Afterwards, heard from Michel. Now let's hear from our president of the Canadian Labour Congress, Ken Georgetti. Historically, Ken is a steelworker, he's come out of BC, and he was the youngest CLC president. And since he's taken over in so many years ago, I don't remember. I've got it in my notes, but I can't find it. He grew the CLC by 750,000 members. And now the Canadian Labour Congress represents 3.3 million members. He was first elected in 1999. He has the Order of Canada and other different honors have been given to him for the exact tremendous work that he's done for the working people in this country. He's also a friend of mine that I've been working with for the last 13, 14 years. And let me tell you something, being president of the CLC is about the toughest job you can find. You got the public sector on one side, the industrial union on the other side, and the nurses on one side, and all kinds of unions together, and 50 unions, and you try to coordinate that to make the movement go forward. And I think he's doing an extremely good job at it, and I know that, like every one of us, he gets criticized, but let me tell you something, he's got the dynamics, he knows where he wants to go, and he's pushing the machine to go forward. And I guess he will entertain us also on the war on workers. Souvent, on se demande qu'est-ce que ça fait le CTC, c'est un peu...
Sometimes we wonder what the CLC does. It's a little bit like when the members ask us what Teachers Canada does, because on a day-to-day basis, it's not things that we see. Programs such as the ones that he's going to talk about. And, you know, we've invested together $6.6 million together. It requires a lot of money, a lot of meetings. You've got to convince a lot of people, lots of conference calls, because everyone has their own idea of how things should work. So that in order for this machine to move forward, and always with one goal, so that we keep a middle class in Canada. So
the President of the Canadian Labour Congress, Ken Georgetti.
Thank you so much, Bob. You know, my lovely wife and I, Cindy, came from Vancouver the other day, and I wanted to say we got out of the pressure cooker, but I can't use that term anymore, I guess, in Vancouver. Sisters and brothers, it is a great pleasure for me to bring you solidarity greetings from the largest democratic organization, and as Bob said, our 3.3 million members, the Canadian Labour Congress. Thank you, Brother Bouvier, your president, for inviting me to speak today.
Dear brothers and sisters, I am very happy to convey solidarity greetings from the largest democratic organization of Canada and of its 3.3 million members at the Canadian Labour Congress. I would also like to thank your president, Bob Bouvier, for the invitation to speak to you today.
Well, Bob is a valued member of the CLC's Executive Committee and the Canadian Council, and a strong advocate, as he says, for the Teamsters in our labour movement. What's most impressive for me, though, is that Bob has a wealth of experience that he's always willing to share, that he's always looking, though, for new approaches for your union, like this major consultation with members that you just had over the last 18 months. I only wish, though, I was here tomorrow to see when you unveil your new Teamsters look, but I guess I'll be able to see it on tape because you're broadcasting this. But just think for a minute back to 1903, when the Teamsters Union was first founded. Think back then, can you imagine those union members driving those teams of horses, pulling wagons of freight, that they possibly could have imagined what the world would look like today 110 years later? Or that the union delegates would be flying to a convention in Quebec City, all of us carrying our smartphones. It's not likely. But nor could they imagine the challenges Teamsters today would face, different than what they had. That's why I admire your convention themes. Times are changing, and so are we. And we are changing, because we need to adapt, always need to adapt. We can't sit still. We need to adapt to our members' needs, to a different economy, to new circumstances all the time. But regrettably, our labor movement today is forced again to fight concerted efforts by right-wing politicians, and of course their big business allies, who want to turn back the clock to those bad old days, 110 years back and further if they could, when unions were struggling just to survive. You know, Michelle made the comment about unions were useful at one time but not anymore. That was said by it wasn't the Globe and Mail then, it was the Toronto Globe in 1894. And they say it today, the same thing. So I want to thank Bob and all of you for all the work that you do, but all the work you did to oppose that federal conservative bill C-377, which unfairly interferes with our democratic right to govern our own unions in open for anyone to see, just like today. But regrettably, we were unsuccessful in our House of Commons about pushing the issues on this bill. But can you imagine those senators in our Senate of Canada? What they did different than the House of Commons is they actually had hearings on Bill C-377. They had 4 days of hearings and heard testimony and points of view that it was punitive and unconstitutional, that the bill actually consisted of anti-union sentiments. They heard from 5 provinces opposed to this legislation: the Canadian Bar, the Privacy Commissioner, mutual fund industry. Man, I was there with the mutual fund industry, and they said to the senators, do you know that any mutual fund that has 1 union member, we have to report the entire conduct of that mutual fund? Their jaws dropped, the senators. They couldn't believe it. And what the Senate did that the House of Commons should have done was kick that private member's bill out. They sent it back with amendments to show those Tories the hypocrisy of that bill. And I said thank you to the Canadian Senate for the first time in my life. But you know, that's a big part of my job, and I find it frustrating that I have to defend our unions from these unfair and baseless allegations and refute falsehoods that are spread about us all the time. What do unions do that's so terrible? You know, I ask myself that. Unions like the Teamsters, you make sure that workers are safe on the job. They have better pay. They can count on a pension plan when you retire. You have dental and vision benefits. In Quebec, you have daycare benefits. And most of all, you make sure that your employers treat your members fairly and with respect. Is that so terrible? Is there something wrong with that? Could you imagine not having unions like yours around to stand up for the fairness your members deserve? Can you think about it? Unfortunately, though, there is a group out there that can imagine a world without unions in the workplace. The Stephen Harper Conservatives and others just like them. In fact, they don't imagine a world without unions. They dream about it all the time. And they're trying to make their dream come true. But the Stephen Harper Conservatives and Ontario Conservatives, led by a guy named Tim Hudak and other politicians, appear determined to provoke confrontation with unions instead of trying to sit down and seek cooperation, which they should do. Bill C-377 was only an appetizer for those federal Conservatives. Last month, they introduced a private member's bill called C-525, which would make it impossible and put barriers in place for workers to organize and join a union in the federal sector, where you have large representation. Le projet de la loi 525
Bill C-525 would impose a mandatory vote for certification in respect with the Canadian Labour Code. But further than that, certification could only be validated by a majority vote from eligible voters and not from the majority of voters. Now, can you imagine if the proposed rules for union democracy were required for Canadian elections,
Stephen Harper n'aurait jamais.
Stephen Harper would have never won his seat.
We can tell from the federal election returns, not a single MP in our current parliament would be elected if, in order to win, they needed a majority of the votes of eligible voters and not a majority of votes cast. Yet that's the proposal in that legislation. But that's not going to end it. C-525 is just another step. They intend to do far worse, these Conservatives, to undermine union dues in an effort to financially destabilize labor and limit our ability to properly represent our members. The CLC believes it will come under a new federal legislation, or a private members bill as they call them, this fall. And in Ontario, the Conservative leader named Tim Hudak is even more blunt. He openly says he'll end the RAND formula if he's elected, and he'll make union dues voluntary for everyone in that province. Let's be clear. If the Conservatives succeed with their plans to dismantle the cornerstone of union funding, the compromise that we build in that Ford strike that happened in Windsor so long ago, membership dues, the change will be transformative. In Ontario, Hudak believes unions defeated him in the last election, and not his own dismal campaign performance. He blames us. So that's why the Conservatives and their allies seek this confrontation. They view us as their political opponents and enemies. And that's why our Congress is mobilizing both affiliated unions and non-affiliated unions in our Together Fairness Works campaign. You'll see it rolling out later this summer. Together Fairness Works speaks to our members and to the Canadian public. But first, we will speak to our members. We need to speak to our members in the largest member engagement campaign ever. Our target is the vast majority of our members who don't show up to union meetings, and they actually see it as the union, not my union. And we need to change that. We need to switch that around. We need to reintroduce ourselves to our members by engaging them in some one-on-one conversations about the value of their union and what we can achieve together and what we have achieved together. Together, we've got fair wages, we've got pensions, decent working hours, paid maternity leave, fair treatment at work, safe working conditions, pay equity, job security, health benefits, and a lot more. Those just didn't fall out of the employer's pockets. We had to go to the table and negotiate those. Together and not divided, we achieve those. And together, we will achieve more. But what does our member engagement initiative do? It reminds our members of our achievements. But let me ask a question in this room. I ask it everywhere I go across this country. How many in this room had to organize a union in your workplace to get there? How many of you? Can you show me? Yeah, about 4 hands go up. That's the challenge. Me too. When I got into the workplace, everything was there. And if the employer hires you and tells you they're there, the union's not there to tell you how you got them, you think the employer gave them to you. We need to go back and have that conversation. Those numbers I just asked make my point. It's why ongoing member engagement is so important to defeating these concerted attacks on unions and on working people. And that's one of the reasons why Bob Bouvier launched the Teamsters' own consultation with your members, I'm sure. Reintroducing ourselves to our members, reinforcing the great things we've achieved by working together is a key component of the Together Fairness Works campaign, because it's how we'll turn our members around from thinking of the union and start calling it my union. Because, you know, I'm prepared to protect things that are mine. I'm not sure I'm prepared to protect things that I don't feel as close to that. Only then will we be able to convince our members that everything here is at stake, because it is. So our movement, we argue, needs to have 3.3 million conversations with all of the people who make this union strong, to get them in a state of readiness for what we see clearly is a coming storm, so that they'll be there for you their union when it comes time that we need them to act. Do you know our Union Advantage campaign? We talk about that. Michelle made a point about that as well. They've turned the Union Advantage, the things we've got at the bargaining table, into a resentment. Is why should they have them because you don't have them? And we argue that you should have them because everyone should have them. That's what we stand for. You know, our Union Advantage in Canada right now amounts to an average of $5.11 an hour. And I love asking this question when I speak to non-union audiences, as I say, how many of you would like your children to earn $600,000 more in their lifetime? You don't have to buy a lottery ticket. You just have to sign a union card. $600,000 more, minimum, in a lifetime. We generate $793 million every week more in Canada just because of our Union Advantage. Think about those rings you hear in those cash registers on payday. I used to see it in my small town. You couldn't find a parking space on payday downtown because we were spending that Union Advantage in those stores. And I find it odd that they argue sometimes, those business owners, that we should take away those rights of unions. I'm sure they wouldn't want to hear the deafening sound of no ring on those cash registers. But we can't also forget, as we take on this conservative agenda that the CLC's on campaign, as Michelle again said, to improve Canada's pension plan for all workers. You know, about 85% of our members have pension programs. In fact, we could probably spend more time on things that are more important in our own workplaces than the Canada Pension Plan. But as the old Labour saying goes, what we wish for ourselves, we desire for all. We mean that. We've made Canada a better place because of the efforts that we've made. We need a better CPP so that no Canadian, union or non-union, ever has to fear retiring into poverty, has to decide on whether to take their pills that day or have dinner. That's not a society we want. We don't want to be like the Americans. We want to be like the Scandinavians, as Michelle says. That's the kind of positive message we need to repeat constantly to influence public opinion. We do good things, but we're silent in our pride. We're building new coalitions by talking to employers and business organizations. We're talking to community leaders, to mayors and councils and provincial governments to encourage them as well to reject this anti-union sentiment and legislation. And we're very clear that the challenges we face today, my friends, are not going to be won by militant speeches or giant rallies. Certainly not yet. That's not what we need to do. We don't need our members to go to a protest. We need them to go next door, to lean on that fence and talk to their neighbors, their friends, their co-workers, to understand that everybody benefits from the work that we have done and we are doing for the workplace and workers. And Bob, I want to end on one very important point. And this is important. We talk about these issues in our opponent's frame using their words, then it's clear their values will prevail. We can't use those slogans like right to work and other things. They don't work. They work for them, not for us. And every time you repeat them, you're going to reinforce someone else's argument. But if we talk about it in our frame, the message appeals to Canadians, the fundamental value that makes us Canadian of fairness, then we can win. Like Michelle says, it's even more profound in Quebec. They understand it, they live it, and they practice it not only in their unions, but also in their policies. So what do I mean by our values? When the conversation with your members turns to why they pay union dues, to protect their wages and benefits and job security, don't argue that conservative frame. Start out by saying it's unethical. It's unethical for conservatives to coach workers to get all the advantages, but not pay their dues. The conservatives are encouraging workers to treat their union dues like a restaurant dining and dashing, like sitting at the table with your friends, but when the bill comes, you leave and let them pay the bill. That's not fair. That's not the way we are. Of course it isn't us. So if our words, your words, reflect the values Canadians believe in, that of fairness and fair play, then we'll win. But it needs to be loud enough that we hear the echo, my friends. It will be difficult. You'll be faced with all sorts of yeah buts and pushbacks. It will be a challenge like no other of our lifetime. We have to reorganize ourselves, do it again. But this is our moment, sisters and brothers. This is our time. C'est le moment.
This is our time. This is the moment when our solidarity will be tested. The solidarity that created our labor movement. The solidarity that has allowed unions to survive every challenge and every crisis.
This is the moment when our solidarity will be tested. Again, the solidarity that created this labor movement, the struggle and fight that had to come to give us the rights we enjoy, the solidarity that has allowed unions to survive every challenge and every crisis. And working together, I know we can succeed. Sisters and brothers, thank you for listening. Thank you for your support as Teamsters, even more as many Canadians. Thank you. Thanks, Bobby.
As you can see, the message from our different leaders, would it be the Quebec Fed or the Canadian Labour Congress, they all have the same aim that we have. That's why ours is, times are changing, so are we. So it's not something related only to us, the Teamsters. It's something that's been lived all over the labor movement, where everybody realizes we got to do something. And always, as I said before, when you try to do something new, sometimes always it ruffles a couple of feathers. But we will do it, and we'll